As you can see, the initial recording that I did on Monday is not in fact uploading to Web Campus. It has made it 26% thus far. So we're going to quit that. We're going to do this, and we're going to try it all again. Please be aware that this video, like that one, deals with issues of historical trauma, hate crimes, and in particular, there will be an image of a swastika that was painted on UNR's campus. So if those are things that you find disturbing or disruptive, please take care of yourself in the way that you need to in order to be well. So scholar strike is going on yesterday and today. So the irony of having to redo Monday's work on the day that scholars are supposed to be on strike is not lost on me. Anthea Butler and Kevin Gannon articulated the call for the scholar strike. They posted this to the blog for Academe Magazine, which is the magazine for the American Association of University Professors. They called for this strike particularly because of what's going on in the world around us and in solidarity with other strike actions. So as Butler and Gannon write, they say it's hard as a professor to think about preparing or teaching a class, writing a book or article, or chairing a panel amidst all of the ambient violence of state violence, senseless murder, and racism. What about our students? If we can't deal with this, how are our students dealing with this? How are our students of color dealing with this? Right? How are folks managing in the middle of what they call this racial maelstrom, right? So they're calling on academics to pause the endless meetings on diversity and inclusion, disrupt our institutions' routines, and look outward to the American public and share our dismay, disgust, and resolve. So this lecture is my action with you all to share my dismay, disgust, and resolve about the way that our systems, especially of education, have contributed to the systemic marginalization and oppression of particularly people of color and particularly Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks. What is the scholar strike? It is an action inspired by professional athletes who went on strike to underscore the importance of addressing the grave injustices faced by people of color in the United States. This is from Gannon and Butler's Academe blog. So if you want to find the source for this, that's where you find it. So these athletes' solidarity was designed to reflect on the failure of our governments, local, state, and national, to reckon with the tragic enormity of racist violence besetting, in particular, the Black community in the United States. Where the state fails, society steps in, right? And it is in that spirit, a spirit of labor solidarity, that the scholar strike was conceived. This is the university's statement in support of Black Lives Matter. On this page, which I won't go over in detail, they point to their immediate actions and their commitments for trying to support Black students and students of color. Here, what you see are the signatories to the UNR Black Lives Matter statement. A lot of the folks who have signed this are big deals in the institution. They are head honchos of their respective portions of the institution, and it goes all the way from the top at the president on down through the deans of the colleges. It doesn't include everyone in the administration, but this is a fair representative of the university's upper administration. So why am I talking to you about this? What can you do about race, hatred, and violence on campus and off? Well, that's what the rest of this lecture is about. What can you do and why maybe you should? The first thing that you can do that's really, really, really important is to ask questions. Lots of questions. Right? When you question the status quo, you give yourself the opportunity to understand whether or not things really have to be the way that they are. So ask questions of the institution. The first question you can ask yourself is, do you think that the institution has done enough to address racism, hate, and violence on campus and in its communities? We just saw the Black Lives Matter statement. Do you think that that statement commits to enough to support students of color in a safe and cooperative learning environment? Do you think the institution does enough to support you in a safe, cooperative learning environment? Question 1. Here's another question to ask yourself does the upper administration, the people who run the institution and make its decisions, does it reflect the student body and therefore represent what you need? Or is it able to tap into what you need to feel supported and safe on campus? Let's ask ourselves this. So if we look again at the signatories to the Black Lives Matter statement, we find something very interesting. We find that the upper administration at this institution is, perhaps unsurprisingly, very white. Not exclusively, but largely. To make this easier, here are the 5 non-white signatories to the Black Lives Matter statement. But is it fair to point out these folks and their proportion if we compare that, say, to the state of Nevada, right? Maybe the upper administration is simply representative of the demographics of our state. Let's see. The state of Nevada is 59% white, 25% Latinx. This is the place where we insert an asterisk to acknowledge that Hispanic is an ethnicity, not a racial group. Latinx is kind of an approximation of a Hispanic racial group, but it's not a perfect fit. However, a lot of this data is recorded in this particular way, so we're just going to roll with what the numbers have. 8% of our state is Black, and 7% of our state is Asian, and then we have even smaller percents, 1% American Indian or Alaska Native. I prefer to use the terms Indigenous, and just under 1% Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. So that's the state. Our student demographics are similar but not the same. So when we think about the administration, we might think more specifically about the students rather than the entire state. It's 57% white, which is pretty comparable to the state, but it's 20% Hispanic or Latinx. And that's 5% lower than the state population. And it is worth asking ourselves why that is. It's 8% Asian. It's 3.3% Black, which is substantially lower than the state demographics. So we might ask ourselves, why are the student demographics lower in the Black and Latinx proportions of the student population? Like, why are fewer of them than are representative of the state? Why are they going to college, or why are they going to UNR? Then we have non-resident aliens and unknowns. So Indigenous peoples don't even register on this graph. What about the faculty? It's important that diverse students are able to see themselves represented in the faculty, because in order to achieve your educational goals, you have to be able to see yourself as a person who knows things, as a person who is an expert in the fields that you're pursuing. So if you don't encounter professors that look like you, then a lot of times you don't stop to think that maybe it could be you. So we see a pretty big disparity here. 57% of our students are white, 73% of our faculty are white. 73%. Less than 10% of our faculty are Latinx, which is less than half of our student demographics, and our student demographics are even less than our state demographics. We have a solid almost 7% of our professors are Asian, which is not as bad of a disparity, but still an issue. And we have very few Black or African American professors, and even fewer Indigenous professors, although at least Indigenous professors register on this graph in a way that they did not on the student demographics. So then we get back to the question. The faculty, they have a really important job at the institution, and we're going to talk more about that, but they are not the ones who call the shots. The university's top administration demographics, based exclusively on the signatories to the Black Lives Matter page, is 83% white. 83%. So those 5 people that we saw that were not white are all represented right here. And here's another important component of this. Only one of them is a woman of color, right? Only one. Even gender is not as evenly distributed in the upper administration as it is in the student body and the faculty, right? So there's 53% of our students and faculty are female and 47 are male. In the administration, it is reversed and then some. Female administrators are just over 1/3 of the total number, and male administrators are just under 2/3. And the higher you go in the ranks, the more male and the whiter it gets. So when we look at the administration of our institution, we have to ask ourselves if we think that the institution's interests line up with yours, right? We're in this institution, but do we think that it wants the same things that we want? So let's learn a little bit about the ranks within the institution. At the top of the tower is the president and his office. He's got his chief of staff, he's got the university's general counsel, and he's got directors of various programs, including the director of athletics. Most recently, the institution has added this position over here for Eloisa Gordon-Mora, the University Diversity and Inclusion Officer. Now, Eloisa is the most recent addition to the president's office, and her position was created in direct response to student activism on campus to deal with issues of race and violence. But you'll notice that the institution doesn't always put its money where its mouth is. So for marketing and communications, people get right around $200,000 a year. For athletics, they get almost $500,000 a year, right? And for diversity and inclusion, we pay $100K, sorry. The next rung down the ladder are the vice presidents. The top of that tier is Kevin Carmen, the executive vice president and provost. So the vice presidents here are alumni, which is fundraising, student services, research and innovation, administration and finance, and health sciences, which means med school. So do you see any of your interests reflected in these top level administrators? We have student services, but do we have teaching, curriculum, anything that directly impacts your experience of college other than the gym? So, worth knowing, these are the next highest paid folks. In fact, some of them, because they're administrators and not directors, right? They're vice presidents as opposed to a director of marketing. They get paid more. And look at Professor Schwenk over here, gets paid quite a lot. And we might have to chalk that up to the fact that A, he's at the med school, and B, he's also the dean of the School of Medicine. So he does double duty. The provosts are the next layer on down. So now we finally get into somebody who deals with things that are directly related to you. So we have David Shintani, who is the vice provost of undergraduate education. But let's have a look at what it means to be this level of an administrator, right? This level of administration also pays handsomely. So does a deanship. So I'm not including here people who are also deans of other colleges. We've seen them already. That's Tom Schwenk, and one of the vice provosts is also a dean. But here are the remaining deans of all of our colleges, and they also get rewarded handsomely for their administrative duties. Except for one. Do we think it's coincidence that the one administrator of color on this page is paid about half of what the others are? Do we? Do we really think so? Worth asking ourselves. All of this information was gathered from Transparent Nevada, which is to say that you have access to all of our salary information, yes, even mine, on this site, transparentnevada.com. And one of the things that you can do in relation to the institution is to check out who makes what and Figure out where the money goes, because where the money goes tells you what the institution values. And it's worth asking yourself, does the institution value the same things that you do? So here's the next question you can ask. What do you even know about the people who teach you and their role within the institution, right? When you think of a university, you think of professors. So let's talk about them. Full professors and associate professors are folks with tenure. So let's talk a little bit about tenure, because there's often some misconceptions about it. What is tenure? Tenure is a protection of academic freedom. It is not here to say that you're unfireable. People can always be fired for cause. Instead, what it is here for is to say that a professor cannot be fired for what they research or what they teach. It is to ensure that the people who do the research are the experts and therefore are the ones who determine what information gets disseminated and what information gets taught. Putting the experts in charge, basically. The key thing that this protects against is having a wealthy donor, for example, give a lot of money to an institution and then say, oh, but I don't want Professor Y to put out his research study about the negative impacts of my product. That's really what tenure is about, is to protect people from the influence of outside forces on the production of academic labor. What about the junior people who teach you? Like me. I am an assistant professor, which means that I am on the tenure track, but I don't have the job protection of tenure yet. So an assistant professor has a 6-year probationary period, essentially in which to prove that their research and their teaching are up to snuff to deserve the protections of tenure. So what does a tenure track professor do? What is their actual job? A typical job description for a tenure track professor is 40% teaching. 40% of our job is teaching, which usually works out to 2 courses per semester. 40% of our job, or an equal amount, is research, right? We're at a research university, which means we have to produce the knowledge for the next generation. That's literally our job. And 20% of our job is service, which is the part where we make sure that curriculum works properly, that our courses are designed appropriately, that the silver core is meeting our students' needs, that kind of stuff. That's in the service area. It usually takes more than 20% of our time, but we only get 20% credit for it. So you might be asking yourself, is everyone who's teaching at UNR on the tenure track? Definitely not. And so it's worth pausing to know the difference between the types of instructors that you will encounter on campus, or as the case may be, through your computer. There's continuing lecturers. They're also permanent faculty, just like tenure track faculty, but they don't move through the tenure process in the same way because more of their focus is on teaching than on research. So they'll have a role statement that reflects, say, 80% teaching and 20% service instead of 40-40-20. Term lecturers do the same job as continuing lecturers, but they have to leave after 3 years. Then there's postdoctoral fellows. Postdoctoral fellows stay for 2 years on a fellowship where their job is primarily to teach within the programs that hired them. So Core Humanities, for example, has a postdoctoral fellow all the time. Then there's teaching assistants. Those are graduate students who are on a teaching assistantship. So they teach as a part of their contract with the university. It's usually a part of their financial aid package, and they get paid a lot less than everybody else to do the same teaching. And the last category of folks who are teaching on this campus, they're called contingent faculty, or you might hear them called adjunct faculty. What does contingent faculty mean? First of all, they're paid by the course, literally $2,200 to $5,000 per course per semester. And that range is outside of Nevada. So I guarantee you that no contingent faculty at UNR is being paid $5,000 per course. They probably get paid more often in the realm of $3,000 a course. But of course, that varies by discipline. So that's per class for the whole length of the semester, not per class session, per course. And if you do the math, that does not add up to very much. They also have no benefits. They have no health insurance, no dental, no retirement, nothing like that. They also have no guarantee of continued employment, right? Next term, they could get a contract, they could not. Many institutions will put limits on the number of courses that an institution will allow each individual to teach, and they largely do that so that they don't have to classify you as being a full-time laborer, even though you're doing a full-time amount of work, because that would entitle you to things like benefits and protections. So if you can't teach more than 3 classes at each institution, you can never reach full-time, and you can never be entitled to the protections that full-time work would get you. And what that means is that lots of contingent faculty members are having to cobble together income by teaching multiple classes at multiple institutions all the time. So they might teach 2 at UNR, and they might teach 2 at TMCC, and they might teach 1 online in order to try and make enough money to scrape by. An annual income like that is around $33,000. And that's if they manage to also get some summer teaching or maybe a winter master course, right? That is not a lot of money to live off of. And this is for highly qualified people with PhDs. And it's worth noting that people don't end up as adjunct faculty because they're not as good at their jobs or they're not as accomplished as their peers who get tenure track jobs. They end up as adjunct faculty because universities have been systematically cutting tenure track positions and replacing them with the cheaper labor of adjunct positions. So there are more PhDs than there are jobs, which means there are tons and tons of smart, qualified people with PhDs who just don't have access to tenure track positions. What does this mean for you, right? It's always a question of how does this get back around to you, and why should you care about what's going on in this institution? 75%, so this is from that same blog, 75% of all credit hours in U.S. colleges and universities are taught by underpaid adjunct faculty who not only lack the protections and benefits of full-time faculty, but are employed on a class-by-class, term-by-term basis. Ask yourself, do you think that someone who is running around to 2 or maybe even 3 different campuses trying to teach 5 classes at a time, and each with 30 students, so that makes 150 students every single semester, do you think that those folks are going to be able to give you a lot of focused, individualized attention? So if that's overwhelming, that's okay. Right now, this is just food for thought. But as you start thinking about your relationship to this institution, you might ask yourself, what else can you do? Okay, so I know some things. I know how to find out some things, but what else is there? First of all, you could learn a little bit about what the institution is and how it got to be the way that it is. I always like to go back to the beginning because that's what my training tells me to do. The origins of the university actually come from the ancient Greek academy. The first 3 things that an individual had to study, they were considered the most fundamental, were the liberal arts of the trivium: grammar, rhetoric, and logic. It was believed that only once a person had mastered grammar, rhetoric, and logic was it acceptable and appropriate for them to tackle more difficult subjects like arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, or the quadrivium. Practical arts like medicine and law were considered lower aspects of study, more like a trade school, and thus were not included in the academies. Fast forward to the Middle Ages, and universities start to emerge more or less in a form that we're familiar with. In fact, some of the universities that continue to exist today were founded in the 12th century. So the Sorbonne in Paris and Oxford University were both founded in the 12th century. So they still had the trivium, and they had a formalized program of study in which once an individual had completed their study of the trivium, they had the right to deem themselves a Bachelor of the Arts. Once an individual had completed their studies of the quadrivium, they were allowed to call themselves a Master of the Arts. Only after having completed their study of both the trivium and the quadrivium were they allowed to enter in to the most advanced forms of study, which were philosophy and theology. Not everyone who went on to study theology and philosophy could could advance to the level where they got to call themselves doctor, that title was reserved only for those most accomplished in their learning. We might also want to look into how the American university came to be what it is. Turns out it wasn't actually hugely different. The medieval university was instituted to educate mendicant friars to go around preaching, and the American university, starting with Harvard in 1636, it was instituted as a seminary as well to educate pastors and parish priests, parsons, I don't know, they're all P's, particularly of the Puritan predilection. So Harvard has had almost 400 years to establish itself as an institution of learning in the United States. It's hard for universities that are newer and younger to catch up when older universities have been capitalizing on their original investments and endowments for centuries longer, right? And in fact, we also have to grapple with the fact that several of the oldest universities in the United States were built on the labor of enslaved Africans. So not only did they get free land, they also got free labor. And as a result, they were able to amass large quantities of wealth that are still a part of those institutions and the way that they function today. But public universities are not exempt from this. Public universities also come from a colonial history. I mean, heck, everything in this country comes from a colonial history because white folks were not the original inhabitants of this land. Land-grant universities, like UNR, were funded by land that the federal government had appropriated from indigenous peoples and then sold to settlers, or more likely speculators, in order to fund the treasury. So the 1862 Morrill Act, note the date, that happened right in the middle of the Civil War, in which the federal government had a lot of land resources that they had appropriated, and they had more that they were looking to appropriate, and they were raising funds by selling those parcels of land. And while they were selling those parcels of land, they also decided, let's make sure that we give some of those lands to each of the states so that they can start their own university institutions, their own institutions of higher education. Indigenous historian Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, however, would point out that this was particularly aimed at the West, where settler populations did not yet outnumber indigenous populations by the requisite 60,000 people, which is what they needed in order to surpass the threshold to obtain statehood. So now, fast forward, right? So universities, we'll go back, right? Universities began in the liberal arts, not trade schools. And then they were instituted to educate the religious orders. And then they were brought to America to educate the religious orders. And while they were doing so, they amassed a lot of wealth and they exploited a lot of labor. And then they exploited a lot of stolen land to become the institutions that they are. And now, here we are. At the present, universities have backed themselves into a corner where they are entirely dependent upon your tuition dollars, right? They have essentially tried to run themselves on a business model, despite the fact that they are not a business and universities don't make profits. Where would a university's profits go? They have run themselves into a financial crisis exacerbated by the pandemic. So the primary reason that universities have an issue with their business model is they've failed to take into account that teaching, which is their biggest major asset, personal interactions between students and highly qualified experts in the faculty, that asset doesn't get cheaper. It can't be mechanized, it can't be outsourced, and it can't be reduced on any kind of business or manufacturing model. As a result, universities, in order to grow, they need more teachers, and the cost of providing education rises higher and higher because the traditional sources of funding are drying up, which is that the state budgets are not appropriating enough money for the higher education institutions. In fact, all of the cuts that state budgets made in most states during the Great Recession, those became permanent instead of temporary cuts to get through the recession and then bounce back afterwards. A lot of those cuts became permanent. And here at UNR, and I'm sure down at UNLV, faculty members took pay furloughs for 10 years. And during that time, not only did they have their pay reduced, but the merit raises that they earned as a part of their work, being recognized for their research, those merit raises never got paid. Ever. So the university owes the entire faculty back payments for work that they did and raises that they earned, but they have not been paid. So the shortfall that universities are experiencing in their budgets is generally made up with tuition dollars. And they do this in a number of ways. They target students who have access to federal funding, like the Pell Grant program. But then they also target students who can afford to pay sticker price for their education, in particular out-of-state and international students. And how do you compete for out-of-state and international students? You build facilities. So the money that they're raising through higher tuition dollars doesn't go back to the people who do the teaching, which is what the university is really here for. Instead, a lot of that money goes back into building facilities and amenities and student services that are designed to attract those high dollar students from out of state and out of country who will pay full price while keeping tuition a bit lower for those who are in state, so that it's still accessible to them. The question of whether or not it is accessible is something you could take up on your own time. So we come back around to the problem, and this is from the Atlantic article that points out the problem of adjunct labor, right? As tuition rises, none of this money goes back to your instructors. Instead, we have an inversion of what the university used to be. In 1970, more than 3/4 of the faculty were full-time instructors, so either tenure track or continuing lecturers. Today, nearly 75% of your faculty are non-tenure track, which effectively inverts the old system. So that's folks who don't have the protection of academic freedom in their classroom or their own personal work. That's folks who don't necessarily have a guarantee of a job, and that's folks who don't necessarily have benefits, right? And that's important for you to know because you have a lot of power in the university. The university as an institution really cares about two things. It cares about the dollars and it cares about its reputation, which is what enables it to attract the dollars. And you as a student have the power to impact both. So students at multiple campuses all across the country have started organizing, and they've started getting some of the things that they're demanding from their institutions because the institutions realize that those dollars are at risk. This is one example of a site of student organization where students have filed their demands of their campuses and of the nation all in one archive. So you can go to this site and check out what kinds of demands that students on other campuses have made. Many of them have gotten at least part of the way to having their demands met. So part of this lecture is really about understanding your institution and understanding your role within the institution. What are you here for? And what can you really get out of this place? And what are they selling you? Is it the same thing that they could actually offer you, right? So know what's happening in your institution and know that you have the power to do something about it. Know what rank your instructors are and consider how that impacts the quality of instruction they're able to give to you. Are they paid enough to give you feedback, attention, and support, right? Do they have time to do that? Or are they loaded down with so many classes that they can't remember which student is which? Right? This is not to denigrate the faculty who are forced into this position. Some of them may well be great teachers, right? But know that their working conditions are not humane and that you as a student have the power to push the administration to hire more tenure track faculty and fewer contingent faculty who are too overloaded to give undergraduate students the attention and the time and the instruction that you came here for. Other things to know. Know what an institution is and how it came to be. Know your institution, not just the university, but your department, your discipline, your field. Know what it was built to do. Examine whether structural inequality was built into the foundations of the institution. What do I mean by this? Not just the university, right? The university was literally built on stolen land, funded by other land that was stolen, and now continues to shut out the populations from whom the land was stolen. Okay, so that's a thing we know. But what about things like computer science? Well, would it interest you to know that IBM was initially created as a part of the giant Jew tracking apparatus of the Holocaust? Modern humanities computing was born in that moment with IBM. So it's worth knowing what your institution was founded to do, because how can an institution that was designed to dehumanize be corrected? So you should know that you have the power to push the university to address systemic inequities in its history through a number of avenues, through structural change, through curriculum reform, and even through financial redress or reparations. You can demand that of your institution. And the last thing I really want everyone to remember is that the systems of marginalization that shut out students also affect faculty at every level, right? Because we were all students once too, and we all went through the same institutions that you're in order to try and get to the other side where we had the power to impact what the institution does, right? So these systems of marginalization and the way they affect faculty, they translate directly into whether or not the institution provides support for diverse students. When you don't have a diverse faculty, you don't have a faculty that understands all the perspective of diverse students, right? So it's worth asking, do diverse faculty get hired in your department? Faculty of color, queer faculty, people with disabilities, do you see yourself represented in the faculty of your department? Do they get tenured? So if they get hired, do they manage to make it through the academic vetting process of the institution? Does the institution deem them to be acceptable enough, legitimate enough to stay? And if not, if they don't get tenured in your department, then how does it happen that diverse faculty are the ones who don't get tenure and yet white faculty often do? And the last question to ask is, even if they get tenured, do they choose to stay? Do they choose to stay in your department? Do they choose to stay at this institution? And if the answer is no, we might have to ask ourselves why diverse faculty don't want to stay at this institution. So if the answer to any of those questions is no, you should know that you have the power to demand that the institution does better, because ultimately the faculty are here for you. And if you don't think that your faculty can deliver what you want, then you need to demand it of the institution. So I'll end this lecture by pointing out that institutions, all institutions, despite what some of our original assumptions might be about universities, institutions are by nature conservative.